Okay, thank everybody. Thanks for coming out. I think we have a great turnout, and it's a really interesting time, I think, to be talking about journalism and the role of the press and investigative reporting. And so first I'd like to just ask you about what your experience was reporting and doing investigative journalism under the Obama administration before we get into some of the current climate.
Yeah, sure. And I just want to start by saying thank you, Gino. Thank you, everyone with CWA. I've had a great experience, and I appreciate it from Alex and everyone who put this on. This is a great event, and I'm glad to be here. During the Obama administration, I've had a whole range of experiences covering dark money, social movements, conservative social movements, the lobbying around the big progressive priorities of especially the first term of Obama. Obama came in 2008 promising big reforms, promising reforms that address climate change, healthcare reform, financial reform coming out of the financial and housing crisis, stimulus, and in reporting both on the substance of those proposals and the moneyed opposition, I kind of carved a niche early in my career from reporting on the nascent protests against Obama and what became the Tea Party to the larger kind of Republican Congress and how they push back against Obama. So, I'm very blessed in that I've had an opportunity to write about the policy interests that attract me to politics, but also, writing profiles of these donor groups that have been active during the Obama administration, to rooting out corruption even in the Obama administration. So that's kind of a general response to your question. Actually, I'll leave it there, but go ahead.
Yeah, there's actually been a fair amount of critical reporting of President Obama since President Trump has taken office. And so I'm curious to ask, how valuable that kind of reporting is to continue looking back when there seems to be kind of a nostalgia for President Obama in the current situation. And so continuing to kind of critique and criticize some of the Obama administration's policies. How useful is that continuing?
Well, I think looking back on the Obama administration, it's clear to me that there were big failures in covering his administration. And, I think in assessing the failures, it should inform us moving forward. I regret not aggressively covering the Obama administration's Department of Justice. Obama came in promising to get tough on Wall Street, promising to crack down on financial sector abuses, the housing crisis. And as he filled in his Department of Justice, he appointed individuals who represented the big banks. Several individuals from the law firm Covington & Burling were given top slots at the Department of Justice. Eric Holder was a partner at that law firm, and that law firm represented everything from Bank of America to Countrywide, these actors that were central to the financial crisis. And going on down, Lanny Brewer, the director of enforcement at the Department of Justice, also came from the same lobbying and law firm. And very few people, both in the mainstream press and in the left-wing kind of independent press, called attention to these appointments. And looking back, seeing that Obama did not prosecute any of the bankers responsible for the financial crisis, didn't push for criminal sanctions on the banks that perpetrated the robo-signing scandal, that you had banks forging documents on an industrial scale to foreclose on thousands of individuals, and basically given a slap on the wrist by the Obama Department of Justice. Looking back and seeing that no one called out the Obama administration appointments that were very close to the industry and refused to enforce the law, that was a big failure in journalism. So moving forward, I hope that I can do a better job and other journalists can do a better job in covering these kind of personnel decisions that really have a lot of influence in enforcing the law or making these policy decisions.
Yeah, and I would say another thing that I think the Obama administration did was really increase the surveillance apparatus. And so I want to ask you about that and how that will affect your work as a journalist, because Donald Trump has said database is okay and watch list is okay and surveillance is okay. If you don't mind, I want to surveil, I want surveillance. And so what do you think when you hear that as far as your work as a journalist moving forward?
Well, The Intercept, where I work as a reporter, we were founded by Glenn Greenwald, and he made a name for himself. He's accomplished in his own right, but he founded The Intercept after publishing the Snowden documents revealing dragnet surveillance from the NSA and these expanded NSA programs to capture all types of electronic communications, not just of targeted terrorists or suspected terrorists, but of every single phone call, all types of different electronic communications that go on in the United States. And what Glenn likes to say is that if he had revealed this scandal under a Republican president, they would have erected a statue of Ed Snowden in front of MSNBC, but instead MSNBC has vilified Snowden and vilified Glenn Greenwald because of the partisan dynamics. But now I think a lot of liberals, a lot of independents are going to get religion on this issue. They're going to realize that a lot of the surveillance tools that were developed after 9/11, supposedly to target terrorists, are going to be turned inwards and used on protected domestic speech, on activists, on people who challenge the state, on protesters, on people who challenge corporate power. Not to say that that hasn't gone on under Obama, but that threat is certainly increased now that we have a president who's openly calling for that type of surveillance. And we've seen examples of this under the Bush administration. The Joint Terrorism Task Force formed by the FBI to focus on terrorism were used to surveil anti-war protesters. They were used to surveil even vegan activists. We've seen these type of anti-terrorism task force. I did a story 2 years ago showing that they were using their resources to surveil Black Lives Matter protests. And the threat has only increased. So we will see more money for these agencies. We'll see more personnel that have less of regard for personal privacy appointed to these surveillance agencies. And now that we have a president who historically has been very interested in spying, has a very low regard for personal privacy, the risk is so much higher now.
And you mentioned the difference in the coverage with MSNBC, and so I want to ask you about that. What did the last 18 months tell us about the liberal media bias, just in covering the Republican primary and then covering the general election, where many journalists really revealed openly who they were for and that their mission was really to stop Trump from being elected?
Yeah, we've never seen anything like this from a partisan point of view. Pretty much every newspaper in America that does endorsements, even some magazines that haven't endorsed in decades, endorsed Hillary Clinton. I think one of the only newspapers that endorsed Donald Trump was a Las Vegas paper that was literally owned by one of his biggest donors, Sheldon Adelson. And on Twitter and social media, you see these kind of old school journalists openly saying, typically a lot of these journalists like to say they don't even vote, but in this election saying they're opposed to Donald Trump, or at least highly suggesting that they are. I think from a partisan point of view, it kind of reflects the larger alienation and anger at the mainstream press, that even with a unified press against Donald Trump, it didn't make a difference. This was an anti-establishment election, and a lot of folks see the media, the mainstream media, particularly the broadcast media, as part of the establishment. So Donald Trump did a great job of harnessing that anger and that alienation and using it against the press. But as for the larger critique that the media is liberal, I categorically reject that. in the sense that journalists are individually maybe socially liberal, fine. But if you look at the coverage of the campaign, how many stories truly covered where the candidate stood on labor policy, on climate change, on any of these big existential issues that our society is facing, our move towards self-driving cars and robotics replacing potentially tens of millions of jobs in the next decade. Did we see a discussion of that? We saw endless hours of Donald Trump campaign speeches just presented to the public with no analysis. We saw hours of coverage on Hillary Clinton's visits to Chipotle and what kind of hot sauce she puts in her purse. But how many people can remember a single segment on television that devoted time to covering where the candidate stood on the war in Yemen? You know, the American military is conducting a fairly secretive war in Yemen today that's leaving millions of people starving, thousands of people dead. We're supplying Saudi airplanes doing daily bombing raids. This is a big issue. I didn't see a single television segment covering this. And from foreign policy to domestic policy, I didn't see a serious, there's obviously some exceptions to this, but for much of the mainstream press, I didn't see a liberal bias. I did see a partisan bias, though.
Yeah, and I'd like to ask you a little bit about your reporting that was critical of Secretary Clinton. You were asking her about her speeches to Wall Street and her ties to Wall Street. But a lot of people said that sort of critical reporting was kind of a false equivalence because she is not as bad as Donald Trump. And so the scrutiny should not be as harsh. And so how do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, I'm not loyal to any candidate. I report based on the public interest, and I'm going to hold everyone accountable, whether they're a Democrat or Republican. And, I think the public benefit of covering any politician is to get them to do better. If you point out corruption, if you point out hypocrisy or problems with the public policy proposals they put out, that's a chance for them to address your concerns, address those critiques, and potentially improve. I broke a story in 2015, early in the campaign, that Hillary Clinton was using a private prison lobbyist as one of her chief fundraisers. And the Clintons obviously have a long history with law enforcement from the crime bill in the 90s that put lots of cops on the street that incentivized prison building in this country. And in response to that story, we saw a number of protests at her rallies, and then a big policy pledge to reject the private prison industry and, if elected, shut them down. So that's, the Goldman Sachs story too. I'm proud of that coverage. That was during the primary, and it is unprecedented for a candidate. Bill and Hillary Clinton accepted over $100 million from special interests that were preparing to lobby her if she had won in private speaking fees. That's very unusual. After doing some reporting on this, confronting her on the campaign trail about these speeches, we saw a big public discussion of the role of money in politics. The New York Times, after my stories, their editorial board called for her to disclose the contents of the transcripts of her speeches. But again, I don't work for a campaign. I work for the reader, and I'm not accountable to whatever kind of partisan bias is out there. I'm going to hold everyone. I'm going to hold everyone to a higher standard.
And you talked about the kind of endless coverage of Trump and just taking his speeches live with very little reporting or analysis. And so what does that tell us about the problem of commercial incentives in journalism, and what other alternative models like The Intercept is foundation funded are there for kind of filling that need for public interest news?
I think people forget that there's a pernicious effect of broadcast media, and that they are ratings driven. It's a big business. They make a lot of money. In the last 30 years, there's been a lot of attempts to reduce the influence of money in politics, proposals to give candidates free airtime so they don't have to constantly fundraise and sell themselves to donors, because usually that money's spent on TV ads. And people forget that your local broadcaster, the big cable television companies, they band together and they lobby for more money in politics. They've defeated a number of campaign finance reform efforts, and so that they like the sleaze. They like the big money flowing into our politics with nasty campaign ads, with candidates going tick for tat, because that just means that they make more money. We did a story last year revealing that the chief executive of CBS News was in a meeting with investors and said, he was cheering on Donald Trump. He said Donald Trump is good for us economically because he might be a carnival barker, but that means higher ratings for us. And he told his investors that as long as Donald Trump's in the race, they make more money. So when we talk about the role of the media, and the New York Times had that great story earlier in the year, last year, that there had been basically a $2 billion in-kind contribution to Donald Trump. So yeah, he didn't have a super PAC. He didn't have early on the big money contributors, but he had the equivalence of lots of free airtime. So in a way, the media establishment, the for-profit media establishment, created the Donald Trump phenomenon. And then in terms of the second part of your question, that's much more complex. We live in a time where local media has been destroyed. The traditional advertising model has collapsed. You see layoffs everywhere. Local news reporting just doesn't exist in lots of parts of this country. I think there's a stat that says that over the last 8 years or something, about 30,000 reporters have been laid off. Even the big papers that are ostensibly profitable, Wall Street Journal is going through layoffs. New York Times is going through layoffs. It's a crisis, and I'm very lucky to be working at a place that's funded by someone who's taken it upon themselves to fund journalism as basically a charity project. But that's not sustainable. And maybe the larger discussion we need to be having, and maybe Donald Trump's election has sparked this, and even though it's a conversation we should have had a long time ago, is how to create more sustainable funding models to employ journalists, to allow people to do independent journalism. I don't have a lot of answers for that. Maybe there are models that local governments can fund. There's the Patreon model of crowdfunding of providing, committing to provide a little bit of money every month to your favorite local media outlet, but that is the crisis in journalism today.
Yeah, what is the role of the audience, though? Because CNN, I think, would defend itself by saying that our ratings are up and this is what people want to watch, and so we're giving people this kind of content. Or even if you look at social media, the clickbait headlines, that's what people are gravitating towards. And so is there a responsibility on the public, though, to want more in-depth coverage and to read those sorts of stories?
We can't have an informed democracy without a vibrant and adversarial press. It just doesn't work. We don't have the information to make those public choices. People don't have time to evaluate every piece of policy that's being debated in every politician's history. So without a vibrant and free press, our democracy doesn't work. It's an existential question. The fact that media has eroded and been replaced by this kind of tabloid model, whether on Facebook or CNN, of whatever sensational headline or cop car chase drives headlines, that's unfortunate. But that's not. Let's just call it what it is. That's not news. That's entertainment.
Yeah, and we had a couple questions from CMCI undergraduate class on this point with fake news. And so what is Facebook's responsibility in policing fake news and monitoring articles and stories for their validity?
Yeah, this is a controversial topic because we've always had fake news. Reporters get it wrong all the time. Media outlets get it wrong all the time. We launched a war in Iraq based on fake news. There are Silicon Valley startups that blow up and are never questioned, like Theranos. glowing profiles in Vanity Fair and New York Times, and it wasn't discovered until last year that their entire product was a sham, you know, they'd raised hundreds of millions of dollars based on a lie. But there is something unique in the shift towards Facebook. Now, the majority of Americans get their news from Facebook, and that's a concentration of power. Facebook's algorithm does not reward quality. It rewards sensational headlines. And Facebook has been, I think, a very bad operator in that not only have they created an algorithm that incentivizes lies by whoever creates the confirmation bias headline that people want to click, they're promoting bad actors, but they're even like doing the blue check mark, the verification on incredibly irresponsible news sites, websites that peddle in misinformation. So that's a big problem, but it goes back to, and then it's a unique problem in that now, we did a story recently that there are a number of political news sites that they regularly peddle misinformation, outright lies. They get the blue check mark, and they've got these kind of weird random names: Conservative Tribune, Western Journalism, whatever. And you look at their Alexa score, their traffic rating, they have more traffic than NPR. They have more traffic than the Wall Street Journal. They have more traffic than the ABC News. That's a new phenomenon. That's different than just news outlets getting it wrong. And as more Americans get their news from Facebook, we need to have a discussion on the role of Facebook in society. It's a concentration of power issue. Whether it's Facebook or any other monopoly power, we have to consider if this is an essential part of society, if it's like a utility like water or electricity, should there be a more proactive government role in decreasing that concentration of power? I don't see that conversation really taking off in Washington, but I think that everyone kind of acknowledges that Facebook has too much power, and it's not something you can just easily boycott either, right? Like it's really ingrained into our society now, and I think in Europe they're having some serious discussions. Like in Germany, they're imposing financial penalties to Facebook for peddling in fake news. But they have a different legal framework. It wouldn't be as easy to do that here. And one other thing to add, in addressing this fake news phenomenon, we have to be careful of an overcorrection, because Facebook and the government could say, okay, you want to get rid of fake news, and they will start censoring and targeting legitimate news outlets. Maybe they'll wipe The Intercept off Facebook or other well fact-checked, responsible news outlets.
Right, because Donald Trump has called everything fake news that doesn't agree with his point of view. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more of a finer tuned definition of what fake news is, and because it seems to have sort of spun from hyper-partisan news to outright fake. Yeah,
sure. I did a story on some of the cabinet officials being appointed or nominated by Trump. And I got called at 1 a.m. by a Trump transition official screaming, "I'm fake news," along with a lot of other profanities. That's the kind of the go-to to discredit the press. But attempts to discredit adversarial press, that's nothing new. Sure, maybe the term fake news is a little bit too loose, but the dynamic of government officials that want to suppress critical coverage, lashing out at reporters, that's nothing new.
Yeah, and this contentious relationship between the Trump administration and the press, it seems like it could be a good thing and something we haven't seen in a little while. But at the same time, is it a little bit of a distraction that Steve Bannon is calling the New York Times and telling them they're the opposition party and that they should keep their mouths shut? Are these sorts of things a little bit too much of a distraction from the day-to-day policy operations?
Well, look, at the beginning of the Trump administration, there were rumors that they were going to close the press briefing room and kick out all the reporters, and there were all these kind of legacy journalists saying, "Oh my God, it's a change in decorum, that he's destroying tradition." But I think that's fine. you don't get much information out of those press briefings, and the kind of symbiotic relationship between powerful government officials and the mainstream press, that's actually not a good thing. And for reporters to instead have a adversarial relationship with whatever administration is in power, that's much better. So there's always going to be these journalists who are used to having stories handed to them by government officials, and now that Trump and his team are demonizing the press and fighting and trying to create this kind of alternative echo chamber, hopefully that gives reporters a spine to ask tougher questions and not to rely always on official sources.
Great. I wanted to ask you about the kind of propaganda apparatus of the right that you wrote a lot about in your book, The Machine, and why the right has been so successful at developing and sustaining a pretty cohesive message. And I just want to read, you wrote on Twitter this morning that under Obama, the right exponentially hiked funding to grassroots organizing and election advocacy orgs. Under Trump, liberals give to charity orgs. I understand and sympathize with the reason for the disparity, but those decisions lead to vastly different political outcomes. So I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this is a fundamental difference between the left and right for a couple reasons. The main reason, the Republican Party, the conservative movement at large, is tied together with an agenda of tax cuts for the wealthy and the rich. There are, of course, many different groups that are part of that coalition: social conservatives, libertarians, folks that care about the deficit and those who don't. But this kind of overarching interest in cutting taxes for the wealthy, a dynamic that's existed for a very long time, is kind of a unifying strategy for the right that doesn't exist on the left. There are many shared values on the left and the different constituency groups, but not this kind of overarching policy concern that makes it easy to organize. That being said, the other kind of related issue that the left and right are so different is that conservative billionaires, big business groups, when they engage in political spending for self-interested tax cut reasons, they give vast amounts not just to candidates, but this kind of political infrastructure that I write about in the book. This has existed for a very long time, but after Obama was elected, there was an effort to raise billions of dollars to revive the conservative movement and the Republican Party by funding local think tanks, by going into communities where the newspaper went bankrupt and there was no local reporting, to hire a very ideological and partisan reporter to cover local issues, but do it through a certain lens, to fund local organizing institutes, student groups, academics, and to create this infrastructure to elect Republicans and to shift public opinion towards public policy goals that are shared by the right. And if you look at if you just do a comparison between how the big left-wing and right-wing foundations and big money groups give their money, a very large percent of left-wing groups give their money to direct services organizations, groups to feed the homeless, library and literacy groups. And I think that's laudable. There's nothing wrong with that, but it leads to different political outcomes. If a high percentage of the political money on the right is going to election advocacy organizations, they're going to be more successful in terms of election time. So that's the kind of disparity I was getting at with those tweets, and my book goes into much more detail. And to be clear here, there are, of course, many big money groups on the left. There are Democratic groups that give a lot of money into elections. I'm just talking about the big picture disparity.
Right. So I wonder what what you think can be politically feasible from a lot of the demonstrations we've seen recently, from the Women's March to the airport protests around the Muslim ban. Is that an opportunity, do you think, for the left to sort of come together and find some kind of political cohesion?
Yes. At this point, 8 years ago, I was traveling the country going to anti-Obama rallies. And these were people who were upset at the new administration. They were shell-shocked that America could be changing so quickly. Very similar dynamic. But the rallies were much smaller. Fewer people showed up. The biggest difference was that the right had organized attempts to channel that outrage at Obama and his policies towards electoral victories in the midterm elections in 2010. And so in 2 short years, from one of the biggest progressive electoral victories in 2008 to one of the biggest Republican midterm elections victories in all of American history in 2010, we saw a dramatic shift in power where they could take the growing social movements against Obama and harness that into political power. One would assume that with even more people protesting Trump than that protested Obama, you see these huge rallies at airports, on Capitol Hill, in communities all across the country, that this will quickly translate into Democratic electoral victories. But it's just too early to tell. And the difference is there isn't that same infrastructure to take outrage and to channel it into electoral outcomes. It just doesn't exist on the left. And if for a lot of places, for much of the country, there are very few issue organizations, and the Democratic Party is basically dysfunctional in most of the country. So I think it's too early to tell. But again, these protests are unprecedented. They're big, and you can tell people are angry.
And I'd like to ask you just finally, before we get into some Q&A, since we're at a university, what is the role of the university? We're having a discussion about politics and the role of journalism. There was some demonstrations last night at UC Berkeley after some students were protesting a speech given by Milo. And so and you talk about in your book as well about the money in universities funding different departments that have libertarian or conservative philosophies. And so where do you see the university playing a role in shaping this kind of public discourse?
Well, for students, this is the best time because you don't have that kind of career concern that, if I protest, if I engage politically, does this reflect poorly on me? Could I get fired? Do I have time? You're not raising a kid right now. You don't have the same type of professional concerns about your 401k. You can take the time to critically analyze what's going on in society, and you have the time to engage. Protest is one way. You can engage in citizen journalism. You can talk about these issues and explain them to your fellow students or to society. You can fulfill that role. I think that's lacking now, especially with the death of local journalism. There are incredible opportunities for students just because they're operating in this special space where learning is encouraged and you have the time to engage politically. So just look historically. So many social movements fighting for justice, for equal rights, to end war, they get started on the campus. And it's possible, we'll see a similar dynamic today.
Great. Great. Thanks so much. And if anyone has a question, I guess you could just raise your hand. And I don't know if we should have a mic to send around. Yeah, Andrew? There's a question right over here. Okay.
I wonder if you could talk about the Democratic primary a little bit and what your thoughts were about how the coverage went of the competitors for the Democratic nomination.
I thought it was terrible. The media failed in its role. I'm going to get the number a little bit wrong, but it'll be ballpark correct. I think there was a study done for broadcast media coverage for the nightly news in 2015. Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton got somewhere in the ballpark of 300 minutes each, or 250. Bernie Sanders got less than 5 minutes, and I think on ABC News, less than 1 minute in the entire year. Even though, in terms of polling, he was doing very well. The rallies were massive and larger than any of his competitors. And I think for both political and social reasons, I think there's a class bias against Bernie among a lot of reporters, but also a kind of a political bias as well because of his ideas. There wasn't a serious coverage of his campaign. And just kind of broadly, back to what we were talking about earlier, our society has a lot of issues. We've got huge challenges, and we didn't see that kind of meaty discussion of where the candidates stand on all the big issues and what it means for you, the citizen. It was just a kind of non-stop cycle of gossipy stories and poll numbers and what the candidates said when they were insulting each other and who raised X amount. I mean, just trivial, vapid coverage, especially in the broadcast media. I pointed this out yesterday. I stopped by a class, and I was just in D.C. You ask any lobbyist or committee chair in Congress what the big priority is this year in terms of the legislature, Congress is completely focused on tax reform. They want a big corporate tax holiday on overseas corporate earnings. They want to lower corporate rates, and they want to preserve their big tax subsidies, the tax credits. This is potentially trillions of dollars on the line. That's what Congress and big business, that's what their focus is. Did you see any coverage of this, of where the candidates stood on these issues? I didn't. And the Democratic primary showcased, two candidates, pretty much. I guess there were others, but the two primary candidates that had vastly competing views on how to address these big issues, but the media did not take time to really explain where the candidates stood and what kind of challenges they faced.
Hi, in Glenn Greenwald's book, he talks about how the Obama administration expanded measures against investigative journalism. I was wondering if you'd talk more about what that is, because I'm not really familiar with it, and how that might be used in a new Trump administration.
Sorry, they asked me to repeat the question for the camera microphones, but the question was, Glenn Greenwald's book dealt with the Obama administration's handling of investigative journalists and what restrictions were placed on them.
I'm nervous about getting this wrong because this is recorded, but I believe that under the Obama administration, there were more prosecutions against whistleblowers using the Espionage Act than all of the previous administrations combined. That sets a very dangerous precedent because, as Donald Trump moves forward, he has the benefit of a very friendly Congress, Republicans in control of both houses. He's soon going to be in control of the federal judiciary as he appoints more judges. So the only check on his power, in many regards, are whistleblowers. And the fact that the Obama administration set this very dangerous precedent of prosecuting whistleblowers using the Espionage Act, potentially sending people to prison for life for simply blowing the whistle and exposing bad behavior and misdeeds by the government, I think. We're a week and a half into the Trump administration, but I think very soon we'll see whistleblowers step up, and it's very likely that he'll use that Obama precedent to go after them.
Any students?
Hi, Lee. Thanks for being here. I wonder if you could comment on Cambridge Analytica and companies like that use personality-based advertising and were employed by Brexit and the Trump campaign and helped recruit rural voters for the Trump campaign.
I can't really answer that. What you're referring to is this big data firm that's kind of a proprietary firm owned by the Mercer family. It's kind of a hedge fund manager and his daughter, who's very politically active, by all reports, politically brilliant. And they were big supporters of Ted Cruz, but after Ted Cruz kind of dropped out of the primaries, they shifted their support to Donald Trump. And you see all these stories about how part of their brilliant kind of master plan in winning the presidency was that they ceded $10 million to Breitbart. They funded the biggest super PACs supporting Donald Trump. They funded the Research Institute that dug up a lot of dirt on Hillary Clinton and published the book Clinton Cash. And the other big factor that they played in this election was that they have this proprietary research firm that, you know, as kind of these data analytics hedge fund people, you know, they're applying these tools that they use to make lots of money, but now to politics. That they're creating these profiles of voters that combine kind of social media and other kind of proprietary data to create these predictive models of what makes them angry, what makes them vote, and kind of concentrate on how to get these people out to vote in a more sophisticated way. You know, I don't know. I know as much as you do. I've read. I mean, Bloomberg has done the best reporting on this. The Wall Street Journal's done a little bit. But I'm a little bit skeptical because you always see these stories every election cycle about the candidate X or Y has the most brilliant big data operation. They can't explain exactly what it does because that's a secret. But of course, it's the special sauce that's going to get them elected. So I don't know. Obviously, this type of data analytics is crucial for any corporate marketing campaign, political campaign, because if you can take that data that people volunteer to social media, to Facebook, and create these profiles, you can predict their political behavior, just like their spending habits, or you know, if you want to sell soap, it's the same thing. But yeah, sorry, that's a long-winded answer to say that I'm not sure about Cambridge Analytics. There's a lot of mystique around it, but we don't know.
Okay. I'm wondering that now that Trump is honoring or giving these influential government positions to billionaire contributors like Rex Tillerson, and now that they have this direct influence in our government, how can they be held accountable by the public?
You know, that's by the public. You know, traditionally, protest, public pressure, raising hell in public venues. That's a good way. You know, I've just seen over the last few days, supposedly, according to reports, the Capitol Hill switchboard has never received this many calls, ever, even during health reform. So people are already kind of voicing concern and flooding members of Congress with angry calls and emails. For Democrats who have been voting to confirm a lot of these nominees, they're seeing an unprecedented backlash. You know, we did a little blog post on Monday showing that Sheldon Whitehouse, the supposedly very liberal senator from Rhode Island, voted to confirm Mike Pompeo, Trump's pick for the CIA, and between 1,000 or 2,000 people showed up to his town hall to shout him down and say, "Why'd you do this? Why'd you vote as a senator who claims to be against torture? Why did you vote to confirm a politician who said that he's going to bring back torture, or has opened the door to bringing back torture?" So we're already seeing this kind of cascading effect of protest and public pressure. But you know, like I mentioned earlier, there are other tools, and get creative. You know, like you might be a student or you might be a journalist, but these tools for holding politicians accountable are open to anyone. You can file a Freedom of Information Act request. You can file for documents that these political appointees have to file. You can kind of look through their backgrounds and judge them on their behavior once they go into office, and let your community know when they engage in wrongdoing. Expose them and make sure other people know as well.
Got time for a few more.
Thanks for being here. I wanted to mention you mentioned the Donald phenomena earlier, and media for profit for covering Donald Trump and everything he was doing. But I feel like a lot of that was to hold him accountable for a lot of the policies he was going to institute. But how would you have said that they should have dealt with that differently?
Well, look, you know, media is not monolithic. Certainly, there are a number of print reporters who did a fantastic job, who uncovered incredible stories about Donald Trump. LA Times and the Wall Street Journal did great stories on Trump University and how he defrauded students. The Washington Post did great stories on Trump Foundation not actually doing any of the charitable donations that they said they did. There was a lot of good reporting, so don't get me wrong about that. It's kind of the larger impact of the for-profit model that early on, I mean, one could argue even like giving Donald Trump, who's a failed businessman, NBC giving him a contract to run The Apprentice and elevating his role as a brilliant businessman, that had an effect on his political biography. But going back to just the early coverage of Donald Trump as a political activist who wanted to claim that President Obama wasn't born in the U.S. and giving that endless coverage because it was a scandalous headline. I mean, is that really news? But we saw coverage of that wall to wall for years. And when he launched his campaign, just using insults, not really defining his policy platform, and for most of 2015 through early 2016, I would say the broadcast media, whether that's the nightly news or all of the cable programs, including MSNBC and CNN, just absolutely vapid coverage. Once Hillary Clinton sewed up the nomination and we moved into the general election, you saw all of the media outlets getting tougher on Donald Trump, with the exception of Fox News. But the Pandora's box had already opened. They'd already given billions of dollars in-kind contributions of free coverage and created his political brand. And by then, he was essentially unstoppable.
5 more minutes.
You mentioned earlier that you reject the idea of a liberal bias in the media. So a long time ago, I don't know how long, Noam Chomsky argued that there is a liberal bias, but the point of it is to sort of set the bounds on your thought. So this far and no further, I think is what he said. So do you agree with that, or do you think that's outdated in the era of Fox News? Or?
Well, no, I mean, I completely agree with that. It's just kind of how you define the term liberal. To leftists, liberal is they think of that term in the European sense, as in believing in neoliberalism and tax cuts and deregulation. But to others, liberal means left wing. So I think what Chomsky's point was seeing it more as the leftist point of view, that there is this kind of role of the media to manufacture consent by setting the bounds of acceptable ideas and not considering anything outside of those bounds. That's absolutely the case. And we see that in any number of issues. Just going back to the primary, it's not a controversial idea to have single payer. Most Western, or a great proportion of Western democracies have single payer. Medicare is basically single payer. Canada is single payer. It works really well. It saves money and there are better health outcomes. Bernie Sanders pushing for single payer, which, again, not that controversial. That's a big scandal among reporters. I mean, I could see reporters visibly scoff when I went to the primary events in New Hampshire, and he would bring up single payer and do his Bernie thing, talking about it. That's the kind of dangerous role of reporters, saying, no, that's a crazy idea, and then let's not even explain what it means to individual citizens. Not explaining, well, okay, if he's proposing an idea, how would it be set up? How much would it cost you? How would it change your doctor visits? Just the kind of basics of reporting. They didn't do that and that's not particular to healthcare. You can apply that to any number of issue areas, but what journalists do, especially in the mainstream press, is set the parameters of what's acceptable, what's serious, and what's not serious. And if they do that all the time.
Students?
Today it seems like a lot of people are apathetic about the news and okay with being in their filter bubbles, especially like Facebook or Twitter or whatnot. There we go. And they'll read some info, but then they'll go vote a certain way just because they feel like they have to identify with one of, and I'm going to say two parties because it's mainly two parties, one of the two sides, and they don't really seem to want to try and at least understand the other side, even if they don't want to agree with it. How do you think journalists can activate the public to want to understand each other because I think a lot of the problem of what's going on is filter bubbles right now, and we saw that a lot in the election.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I don't have a good answer to it, but you know, in my reporting, the least I could do is to elevate interesting voices on the right that make compelling arguments, that challenge power, that are true mavericks. You know, in Congress, for example, there are some very interesting House members on the Republican side that do fascinating work. You know, and I might not agree with their values or their positions on every issue, but you know, Walter Jones, congressman from Eastern North Carolina, is Republican, but he's one of the biggest champions of fighting back against the role of big money in politics. He's pissed off his colleagues on both Democrats and Republicans for challenging the role of big banks in Congress and challenging the influence of lobbyists, that lobbyists come in and literally write the bills and give it to congressmen. I mean, he'll call this out, and you don't see many Democrats calling out this dynamic to the same degree that he does. Justin Amash, a congressman from Michigan, has been a true champion for privacy and standing up against the surveillance state, where a lot of Democrats were hesitant to challenge Obama after the Snowden leaks, to challenge NSA power. And many Republicans, of course, as well, very reluctant to challenge the security state. Justin Amash really led the way. So I think it's, you know, it's very easy to slide into this kind of hyper-polarized world and to click only headlines that kind of confirm your own biases. It's a dangerous thing, and I can understand it, but it's important to go out of your way to find people who, you know, might have a bit different background or partisan allegiance as you, but are doing interesting public interest work. It's you know, it's very dangerous to put yourself in any kind of bubble. So always reach out. And you know, I read a lot of conservative media outlets. You know, even though I consider myself more to the left, the American Conservative is a fantastic magazine. I'm not endorsing all of their views, but they have a lot of great writers, and I encourage people to read outlets like that.
Got time for one last one.
So as an investigative reporter, what are the chances that somebody like you will uncover the Trump's tax records?
Well, you know, this is just such a crazy time because, you know, Donald Trump, every kind of sign points to being one of the most secretive administrations in history, not revealing his tax returns, not going through interagency review to do these executive orders, not really revealing what all these LLCs he's set up all over the world actually do. You know, even his White House counsel, his new lawyer, Don McGahn, is known as a lawyer in D.C. who specializes in hiding political money. So there are a lot of big questions like this, and if you look me up, Lee Fong, LH Fong on Twitter, you can always send me a tip. But I'm really relying on whistleblowers and hackers and people who are willing to stand up and risk their career and life to expose wrongdoing. And if people do want to leak me documents, you know, I'm very lucky to be at a media outlet that will provide legal resources to protect whistleblowers. You know, we have an in-house counsel that specializes in this type of thing. So if you come across Trump's tax returns, you know, drop me a line.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming here tonight on behalf of the CWA community. And
Hey, thanks, Alex.